On the morning of April 27th, 1945, one of the most feared dictators in modern history was sitting in the back seat of a German military convoy, wrapped in a Luftwaffe overcoat, hoping no one would recognize him. Just days earlier, Benito Mussolini had commanded millions. Now he was hiding. By the next afternoon, he would be dead, shot, strung upside down, and left on public display before a jeering crowd in Milan. This is the story of those final 24 hours. A dictator without a country. To understand those final hours, we need to understand how completely Mussolini's world had collapsed. By April 1945, the Italian Social Republic, the puppet state he had been running under Nazi protection in northern Italy since 1943, was crumbling on every side. Allied forces were advancing rapidly from the south, partisan fighters controlled the countryside, and even his German allies were quietly negotiating their own surrender behind his back. Mussolini had spent the last days of his regime holding increasingly desperate meetings in Milan, hoping to broker some kind of deal. Perhaps with the partisans, perhaps with the Swiss, perhaps with anyone who would listen. None of the talks went anywhere. His inner circle was dissolving. Old allies were fleeing. The man who had once declared that Italy would make the 20th century a new Roman Empire was now a fugitive in his own country. On the evening of April 25th, he left Milan for Como, near the Swiss border, escorted by a small group of loyalists and SS troops. There was vague talk of a last stand in the Valtellina, a mountain stronghold where fascism would fight to the bitter end. But no such stronghold existed in any meaningful sense. It was a fantasy, a final performance of defiance from a man who had built his entire career on theatrical gestures, discovered on the road to nowhere. By the morning of April 27th, Mussolini had joined a German military convoy heading north along the western shore of Lake Como. The convoy carried German soldiers and a handful of Italian fascist officials, all trying to reach the Austrian border before the net closed entirely. Mussolini, reluctant to simply walk away but out of options, climbed into one of the German trucks and pulled the heavy coat around him. Some accounts say he hid behind boxes. Others say he was simply sitting among the soldiers, hoping his presence would go unnoticed. It did not. At the small lakeside town of Dongo, the convoy was stopped by a group of communist partisans belonging to the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade. The partisans were searching vehicles for escaping fascists and German officers. As they worked through the convoy, one of them, accounts differ on exactly who, pulled back the coat and recognized the sunken, unmistakable face of the deuce. Mussolini reportedly offered no resistance. He was taken off the truck quietly, almost meekly, and placed under partisan guard. The news traveled fast. Communist partisan leader Luigi Longo was informed. So was the Communist Party's representative in the north, Luigi Valiani. And word reached a man named Luigi Cadorna, and crucially, a figure whose identity would fuel conspiracy theories for decades. A partisan officer who went by the name of Colonel Valerio. His real name was Walter Audicio, committed communist operative who had been given orders from the party's leadership in Milan. His mission, as it would turn out, was not to capture Mussolini. It was to execute him. A farmhouse on Lake Como. After his capture at Dongo, Mussolini was moved and eventually held overnight at the Villa Belmonte in the village of Bonzanigo, near the town of Azzano, in the hills above the lake. He was kept under guard in a simple bedroom, reportedly calm but visibly broken. His longtime mistress, Clara Petacci, had insisted on staying with him. She had been captured separately in the convoy and had refused to be separated from him. The two spent their final hours together in that house. What Mussolini said or thought during those last hours is a matter of partial record and heavy speculation. Witnesses described him as quiet, sometimes staring blankly, occasionally making remarks about history's judgment. He had, after all, spent 20 years reshaping Italy in his image. He had invaded Ethiopia, allied with Hitler, dragged his country into a catastrophic world war, and overseen a regime of political violence. Whatever private reckoning he faced in that farmhouse bedroom, no one recorded it in full. Clara Petacci, by contrast, appears to have been more animated. Frightened but devoted, reportedly attempting to reassure him and insisting she would stay by his side no matter what came next. She was 33 years old. She had been his companion for more than a decade, a relationship that had been both celebrated and scandalous throughout the fascist years. She had no political role, no great crimes to her name by most accounts. She would die alongside him anyway. The gates of Villa Belmonte, April 28th, on the afternoon of April 28th, 1945, just one day before Adolf Hitler would shoot himself in his Berlin bunker. And 1 week before Germany's formal surrender, Walter Audisio arrived at the Villa Belmonte with a small group of men. He presented himself to the guards as a fellow partisan bringing orders from Milan. There was some initial confusion and resistance from the guards, but Audisio was authoritative and had the political backing of the Communist Party. He was allowed through. Mussolini was brought outside. According to Audisio's own later account, though the precise details have been disputed for decades, Mussolini was walked to the gate of a nearby villa, the Villa Belmonte, and stood against the stone pillar. Audisio produced a machine gun. Mussolini reportedly stared at him. There are accounts that he opened his coat and said something along the lines of, "Shoot me in the chest." Some historians believe those words were invented after the fact. Others find them plausible. We will never know for certain. The gun jammed on the first attempt. Audisio switched weapons. He fired. Mussolini fell. Clara Petacci, who had thrown herself in front of him or was standing close by, accounts again vary, was shot as well. Both died at the gate of that small lakeside villa, in a village that most of the world had never heard of. Benito Mussolini was 61 years old. The bodies were transported overnight to Milan and dumped in the Piazzale Loreto, a public square that had been deliberately chosen. It was the same square where, just the previous August, the Nazis and Italian fascists had publicly displayed the bodies of 15 murdered partisans as a warning to the resistance. Now the logic was reversed and the symbolism was unmistakable. By morning, enormous crowds had gathered. The scenes were ugly. People kicked the bodies, spat on them, threw things. Eventually, to keep them visible above the crowd, the bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, and several other executed fascist officials were strung upside down from the steel girders of a half-finished gas station canopy. Photographs were taken and circulated worldwide. Later that day, under pressure from the Allied command, the bodies were cut down and eventually taken away for eventual burial. The crowd slowly dispersed. The 20-year fascist experiment in Italy was over. Within a week, the war in Europe would be over too. Benito Mussolini had risen from a socialist agitator to the inventor of fascism, the first of Europe's 20th century dictators to seize power and hold it. He had ruled Italy for 23 years. In the end, his 24 final hours were not a last stand, not a flight to freedom, not a dramatic negotiation. They were a slow, quiet disintegration, a man stripped of power, hiding in a coat, captured without a fight, and executed at a gate while the world was already moving past him. If you found this video worthwhile, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment below. What aspect of this story do you think deserves more attention? And if you want to go deeper, our next video covers the fall of Hitler's inner circle in those same final days of April 1945.